Carmageddon Reincarnation is the fourth and latest installment in the Carmageddon series. Released after a 15-year gap between entries in the franchise, Reincarnation was intended to be the series' bombastic return onto the gaming landscape, the start of a new era that would re-establish the series as a household name. It did not do that. Luckily, the story doesn't end with the poorly received original release, as Stainless would continue to update the game and eventually come out with a more stable and feature-complete version called Carmageddon Max Damage, which is what I played for this video. It's been a long time coming. This series has been the sole focus of my channel, outside of a slight diversion, for a month now, so get ready for the grand finale of my playthrough of this series as I race down the highways and commit massacres on the motorways of... Alright everyone, we are back to Carmageddon. I know it's been a while since my last video on these games, but that's because it took me some time to beat this game. It's by far the longest in the series, and on top of that, I actually played through it twice, so you understand why this one took some time to do. If you haven't watched my other 3 videos on the Carmageddon games, then I highly recommend you do that, not just because seeing the view count go up makes my ego artificially inflated, but also because those videos will provide some pretty valuable context for a lot of the behind-the-scenes details of the series that I'm about to go over. In the aftermath of the release of TDR 2000, the series was in the most awkward state imaginable. The publisher, SCI, had basically destroyed their reputation with the original developers, Stainless Games, who were shafted during the production of the third entry and relegated to a support studio. Taurus, the people behind TDR 2000, were basically developers for hire, with no real ties to the property and who presumably already had existing obligations that prevented them from working on a follow-up. This meant that the series was in a bit of an awkward position where the publishers wanted a new game, but the only 2 people who knew how to make Carmageddon weren't in a position to. This is the general explanation for the enormous gap in the series release cycle that followed, but it's not the full story, because behind the scenes during that 15-year hiatus, 3 separate projects that attempted to continue the series were started and quietly cancelled. The first of these attempts was Carmageddon TV. At the turn of the century, as the console market really began to take off in the US and systems like the PlayStation 2 became more graphically capable, SCI was looking to introduce the series into the console market. In pursuit of this goal, they contracted a studio called Visual Science to create the 4th entry. Intended as something of a slight change in direction for the series, Carmageddon TV was meant to largely drop the dystopian setting of the previous games in favor of a more grounded and satirical approach to the world and story. Set in a vaguely modern rendition of the United States, the setup of the narrative was that the Carmageddon competition was now a reality TV show that was made to entertain a populace that had become numb to violence and extremity due to the rise of the 24-hour news cycle and the internet making access to violent footage trivially easy. Though much of the core gameplay was exactly the same, driving around large arenas, running over civilians, and crashing into opponents, there were also intended to be sections where the player actually left their car in order to beat up pedestrians and steal vehicles. Unfortunately, the development of CTV was severely hampered by miscommunication between the dev team and the publishers, as well as near constant disagreements between the two over the direction of the game. This led to a fractured, chaotic development, where months of work on various different levels and vehicles were scrapped overnight at the ever-changing whims of SCI. After 2 years of development, the game had finally begun to take shape and solidify into something that could eventually see a commercial release. But with a new generation of consoles on the horizon and the landscape of the industry changing rapidly, SCI lost interest in releasing the title and had it cancelled, throwing all the work the studio had done down the drain and financially crippling them. Visual Science was forced to close later that year, and the wider public had no knowledge of the lost Carmageddon title other than a vague press release and a leaked concept for a teaser trailer that was leaked well after the development had already ended. Following the tragedy of Carmageddon TV, Eidos Interactive began development on a PSP exclusive title called Carmageddon Forever. Very little is known about this game, as the only evidence of its existence is a few images of concept art uploaded by someone who worked on the game, as well as some screenshots and renders that have been leaked onto the internet over the years. Also some main menu renders that were found in the files for Wacky Race's Crash and Dash. I don't know how the fuck that happened. Lastly, we have Carmageddon Crude Awakening, which was intended to be a full reboot of the series for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Similar to the PSP game, there's really not a lot of info online about this, other than the basic design goal, which was to let the player loose against pedestrians and other drivers in what was simply described as a weird city. What sticks out to me from the scant few images we have is the visual design the game was going for. The in-game screenshots indicate that it would have doubled down on the futuristic setting of the earlier games, and this poster that says Vote Max, accompanied by a familiar head profile, has some pretty interesting implications for what the game's story could have been. In addition to this, the concept art seems to showcase a much more stylized design for the characters. Developer comments say they were going for a Team Fortress 2 style look, which checks out. For reasons unknown though, SCI shit-canned this game as well, yet another decision which massively fucked over the studio behind it, Pseudo Interactive, and forced them to close their doors soon after. From this point, as far as we know, there were no further attempts to pursue creating a new entry in the franchise, and it lay fully dormant for the next few years. In the early 2010s though, Stainless Games, the original studio that created Carmageddon, was able to purchase the rights for themselves and begin work on yet another attempt to resurrect the franchise. In 2012, a Kickstarter campaign was launched for Carmageddon Reincarnation. Funding was achieved, and the game entered full development. After 3 more years, the world was finally graced with the long-awaited 4th entry in the Carmageddon series, and it got mid-reviews and sold kinda poorly. Fuck. Common complaints on release were that there were no real gameplay innovations and it tried too hard to stick to the formula of the first game, copious amounts of bugs and glitches, and a fraction of the content that was provided by earlier games in the series, namely the much smaller roster of drivable vehicles. Stainless got to work on rectifying at least some of these issues though, and a year later released a more complete edition under the title Carmageddon Max Damage. This is the version that is currently available from online retailers. Here's where I enter the story, because from this point on, this video is about my personal experience with this game, a product that is the culmination of 15 years of failed projects, a Kickstarter campaign, and the blood, sweat, and tears of the people who worked to get this damn thing out the door and onto my PC. First things first. Since this is a modern game, it advertises that it has controller support. I actually tried to play the first 3 games with my PS4 controller, but it didn't work on any of them, so I just said fuck it and went with mouse and keyboard. For this one though, I actually managed to use the controller. Let's see how that went. So if you can't tell what's happening in that clip, there's basically 2 things going on. First, plugging in the controller fucked the camera all up and made it to where it was constantly flipping to a side view of the car, and in order to get it behind me, like normal, I would have to hold the triggers in just the right way. The second thing is that for some reason, all of the buttons were completely mislabeled. Not only was it showing me Xbox buttons, they weren't even mapped to the equivalent buttons on my controller, which basically meant that nothing was where it should have been. Yeah, I said fuck all this garbage pretty quick and just went back to mouse and keyboard. The other immediate issue I had, you could probably also notice in these clips. I've kind of tried to hide it in some of the earlier bits of footage I've used in this video, but this issue was so constant it's kind of impossible to hide for long. That issue is the fact that at seemingly random intervals, some of the pedestrians on the map would transform into these giant papier-mâché beings that enveloped my whole screen. Sometimes it was bearable, and it didn't make that big of a deal. Other times it made the game almost unplayable, especially when it affected my character model. I tried to see if there was a fix for this, and apparently not only is there no real fix, other than fucking around with registry files, which is always a minefield, but apparently this issue is only present with AMD graphics cards for some reason. So if you're a NVIDIA, you won't have this problem. That was a joke, by the way. I had a NVIDIA graphics card for years before getting an AMD, and I only switched because my friend recommended me the part when I was building my new PC. I honestly have no idea what's the difference between the two. So, we've already got 2 big technical hurdles that are semi-game breaking, and I've only gotten 5 minutes of footage. This bodes well for the rest of this experience. Except surprise, I actually got kind of lucky for once, and these are pretty much the only 2 technical issues I ran into. The papier-mâché monsters were an annoyingly constant aspect of my playthrough, but other than that, the game is pretty stable. So we've got the tech issues out of the way. What's the setup of this game? Unfortunately, there isn't one, really. This game completely forgoes the one singular improvement that TDR200 made over the first 2, and does away with any attempt at backstory or even atmosphere. It's still kind of vaguely futuristic, but feels a little closer to the second game in terms of relatability. In terms of the characters, most of them are pulled from the cast from the first game. The same goes for the levels, many of which are remakes or reimaginings of locales from the original, though again, they feel less dystopian in their presentation. Thankfully, there's no attempt at doing those dumbfuck missions from the last 2 games, but there's still an attempt at doing something other than the base Carmageddon formula. The classic gameplay mode is still present, of course, but alongside this, there's several other game modes that are now present. Many of them are slight variations on the existing gameplay loop, but some of them are a bit more drastic in their departures. I think the ones that are the closest to the normal races are the levels where you have to select a certain amount of checkpoints, the ones where you have to run over a certain amount of pedestrians, and the ones that are just straight up death matches. One thing that I really like about the checkpoint and pedestrian missions is that you can still choose to ignore the objective entirely and just wreck your opponents, which allows you to steal points from them, something that maintains the gameplay freedom that the series is known for. The two game modes that are a bit more different are the death races and the catch the fox game mode. The death races actually force you to race, similar to the main game mode but a lot more restrictive since now your opponents can actually finish the race themselves, meaning you have to stick to the section of the map that the level takes place on. It's still better than TDR though, since like the checkpoint and pedestrian levels, you can steal laps from your opponents by wrecking them, so it's not annoying like in the last game. The Fox game mode is probably the most different from the standard loop. It's basically the world's most destructive game of tag, where one person is the fox and everyone just fucking rams into them over and over again, so the fox status keeps bouncing around between everyone until finally someone gets lucky and leaves that orgy of motor oil behind and is like, fuck man, that shit was crazy. And they just drive around in circles for 2 minutes because everyone else is still stuck in that clusterfuck. Moving on to the characters, I'm happy to report that Reincarnation has by far the best system for unlocking them. The whole concept of some cars being steal-worthy and others not comes back, but instead of only a fraction of the cast being arbitrarily locked behind this system, every car in the game has the potential to be stolen, and it just cycles through which one you can jack in each race. Nice and simple, transparent and doable. By the end of the game, I had unlocked all of the base vehicles and 2 of the secret ones. Some of the standouts for me were the Cleaver, driven by Valhalla, she-wolf of the AA meeting. It's a pretty good early game car that can take out other people's wheels really easily thanks to the spiked tires. Vlad and his Annihilator return are just as dogshit as they've always been, completely unable to make any turn in the game, which renders it completely useless in almost any scenario. Madam Scarlet also comes back, now driving a convertible called the Shredlight, which is surprisingly powerful for such as small car, in addition to being fast as fuck. The Bear is also back, once again driven by Ivan the Bastard, and this thing is probably the second worst car in the game. It's slow, handles like shit, and every time you run over a pedestrian, they get caught on the blade and fuck up your trajectory, which makes it almost impossible not to spin out. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Crazer, driven by Roman. Not that one, don't make a bowling joke. The Crazer handles like a dream, has a good top speed, and does a lot of damage when you hit opponents. This also really highlights how this game has far and away the best damage system out of any of the series. No more of that bullshit where you have to get a head-on collision or else you're not doing shit. If you crash into a sumbitch, you gon' hurt him. It's great. Once I hit the late game, I almost exclusively used the Towmeister, formerly driven by Psycho Pitbull. It's a little on the slower side, but at this point I had enough upgrade tokens to where that didn't really matter, so this thing got a lot of use just because of its sheer destructive capable. It also has a monster mouth on the front, so you can say you drive a truck that eats people. Another car that sucks ass is the Siamese Dream, piloted by the Terrible Twin. It's the fastest vehicle in the game, owing to the fact it's a goddamn fighter jet, but good luck turning this fucking thing and good luck killing anyone with it. We're in the final stages of the game now, so we start driving with the big dicks on the block. Halfwit Harry and the Lumberer return, pretty strong, but the lack of speed or handling holds it back and keeps it from being appealing in the late game when other options are stronger and do more damage. Mother Trucker and Rigor Mortis. The most interesting thing about this vehicle is that it spawns with a trailer attached, which sucks and is useless. Just disconnect it at the start of the race, click enter, it's easier than anything else. You got this, champ. Once you do that, you got a car that fucking eviscerates anything it comes into contact with. Last 2 members of the base roster are the Plow, driven by Don Dumpster, which expectedly is a force in nature, an unstoppable object that tosses everything else in the game to the side like it's a Hot Wheels car. Then we've got the Electric Blue, driven by Stella Stunna. Despite being pretty small, it's got a good amount of punch to it, but the best part of it is that it electrocutes any pedestrian near it in a 360-degree radius, meaning you're going to have 100 bales of money in your trunk within the first 5 minutes of the race. Towards the end of my career in high-octane crimes against humanity, I also unlocked 2 secret characters. The first was Agent Debbie O'Nuts. What the fuck? She drove the Super Suppressor, a giant brick on wheels that also has a detachable trailer. Just go ahead and chuck that shit off into a ditch. And if you even so much as graze another car, it's just gone, dude. There ain't nothing there anymore. It just gets deleted. Last, and not really least, but not super far off from it, is the Suppressor, driven by Chief Bigham. It's powerful, but really slow, doesn't decelerate when you need it to, and by the time you can make a full turn with it, you're going to be checking into a retirement home. Kind of disappointing to drive this thing, not gonna lie. In addition to this, there's also 2 characters to play as. I did my first playthrough as Max Damage, the classic car-crazed psycho that was the main character of the first 3 games. But there's also Diana, returning from the first game as Max's equally psychotic feminine counterpart. In order to see how the playthroughs differed, I did a second run where I picked her. Now the first difference is that she starts out in another car, the Hawk R as opposed to the Eagle R. The second difference is that there isn't one, and the story is the exact same regardless of who you pick, so this was a huge waste of my fucking time. At least the game is fun. I guess there is one other difference, though I'm not sure if it was just me or what. I did feel like the second playthrough with her was a lot buggier than the first. The texture glitch seemed to happen more often, and my game actually crashed a few times, but I don't know if there's actually issues with playing as her or I just got unlucky. After beating the game a second time, that brings my story with Carmageddon Reincarnation to an end, and by extension, my story with the whole franchise. Reincarnation is kind of a sad case since it was supposed to be a relaunch of the series that marked the beginning of a new era for the series and bring it back into the spotlight. Unfortunately, it got lukewarm reception from fans who were displeased with the bugs and lack of cars on the roster, plus critics who just didn't like the gameplay loop in the first place. All this contributed to the game being an overall commercial failure, which put Stainless in some pretty dire straits and forced them to sell off the rights to the series to THQ Nordic, who have done absolutely nothing with the Carmageddon name other than some DLC for Wreckfest. They got the franchise in 2018, by the way. I think at this point, it's pretty safe to say that the series might have gone under again, sadly, possibly for good this time. The story of the Carmageddon series is a really sad one, full of missed potential and the prospect of what could have been. This is a common story all throughout the gaming industry, especially nowadays when we're in the midst of near constant mass layoffs, studio closures, and project cancellations. It's always been rough in this industry, and Carmageddon is proof that very few series are safe from the mismanagement and financial apathy that plagues the industry. What makes it even worse is that the failure of Carmageddon to return the series to the front and center of the industry is that it's really emblematic of the total death of car combat games as a genre. These types of games were my absolute favorites going on into my early childhood to tween years, and they've completely vanished. They're like the fucking Roanoke colony of video games. Twisted Metal has been AWOL since the reboot bomb back in 2012, and Sony recently canceled another attempt at a reboot. Vigilante 8 has been deader than a doorknob since V8 Arcade got unceremoniously shat onto the Xbox Live Marketplace back in 2008. None of the other entries in the genre were ever able to gain any real traction into the 7th generation, and just like that, you've got a whole species of video game that has gone completely extinct. There's a tiny bit of hope on the horizon. Some indie team is making a game called Wreckage that's basically a remake of Twisted Metal 2. It's apparently about to enter some kind of private testing period, which, hey guys, if you want me to, I guess I can find the time to check it out, but it's going to be pretty hard to fit in my schedule since I'm this massive YouTuber, you know. New Blood Interactive of Dusk and Ultrakill fame are also apparently working on a car combat game, of which we only have a single screenshot of, so who knows how long it's going to be until we get our hands on that. I have no idea if either of these games are going to be able to take off in any specific way, but we can hope. The main things that make me hopeful are seeing how big the revival of FPS games and survival horror titles have been in recent years, with no sign of either of those trends slowing down. If these guys can tap into that cult audience for car combat games that exists but is currently not being catered to, I think there's a good possibility you could have the same ripple effect that Dusk and Tormented Souls did with their respective subgenres. Whatever, I'm done with my depressed boomer rant. Reincarnation was kind of a bittersweet experience because it was fun, it was enjoyable, but at the same time, now I don't got no more Carmageddon to play. Except for beating a race with each car across every game. I'll do that later. To sum up, Carmageddon Reincarnation is a pretty good nostalgia trip for fans of the first game and a good send-off to the series even though it wasn't supposed to be. If you have an AMD card, you might want to avoid it because as you can see, I can't. If you've got a NVIDIA card though, you can get a lot of enjoyment out of this game. With Carmageddon behind me, I'm off to play every other game in my backlog now, which is a lot because Steam sales exist. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go start working on that. Just kidding, I also started playing Dead by Daylight. I'm gonna go drop a 3K and still get called trash. Hey everybody, if you made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks. It means a whole lot. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all your standard YouTube outro stuff that you always hear. And other than that, I'll see y'all in the next video. Goodbye.